The waiter moved through the kitchen with calm precision, his hand steady as he placed the torn $20 bill into his apron pocket. The head chef gave him a sympathetic look, shaking his head. "Some people just enjoy being cruel," he muttered. The waiter only smiled, a small, unreadable expression. "It's all right," he said. "She doesn't know any better." The chef snorted. "If you ask me, she doesn't want to know any better." Maybe that was true. But the waiter had seen people change before, though not often. And certainly not easily. He stepped out the back door of the restaurant, inhaling the cool night air. The city stretched out before him, tall buildings, flashing lights, cars honking in the distance. A world constantly moving, filled with people making choices, good and bad. He pulled out the torn bill, running his fingers over the edges. Humans had strange customs. Assigning value to small pieces of paper. Measuring a person's worth by their appearance, their status, their money. But he knew better. Because unlike Karen, unlike everyone in that restaurant, he wasn't really one of them. For the past 6 months, he had worked as a waiter, blending in among the humans. Watching them. Studying them. His real mission was far greater than taking orders and serving food. He had come from a world far beyond Earth, from a civilization that had once called this planet home. His ancestors had left centuries ago, advancing far beyond what Earth's people could imagine. But now, they were watching again. Deciding. Would humanity be given a second chance? At first, he had been hopeful. He had seen kindness, parents caring for their children, strangers helping one another, moments of pure compassion. But then, there were people like Karen. Selfish. Cruel. Blind to the impact of their actions. Tonight had been just another test, and once again, humanity had failed. He glanced back at the restaurant, his eyes shifting slightly, a flicker of something not entirely human. Karen thought she had won. That she had walked away without consequences. But she was wrong. Very wrong. Because he had decided, it was time for her to learn a lesson. And unlike her, he wasn't cruel. But he was patient. And he was going to show her exactly what it felt like to be powerless. High above the city, unseen to the human eye, a silent craft hovered in the sky. It wasn't made of metal or any material known to Earth. It shifted, almost blending into the night, existing just outside the perception of those below. Inside, the waiter stood in front of a glowing screen. Data scrolled across it, her name, her past actions, patterns of behavior. Every cruel remark, every entitled outburst, every moment of selfishness. This wasn't the first time Karen had mistreated someone, nor was it the worst. The waiter's real name was something no human could pronounce, but here on Earth, he had taken on a simple name to blend in. He had worked quietly, observing the people of this planet, looking for signs of progress. But time and time again, he had seen the same thing: greed, arrogance, and cruelty. His mission was clear: judge whether humanity still had a future. His people had left Earth long ago, evolving far beyond what humans could imagine. But they had never forgotten their home. They had been watching. And now, he had to decide, was Earth worth saving? He looked at Karen's data again. Tonight was just another example of the worst of humanity. A woman who saw kindness as weakness. A person who took without giving. But was she beyond saving? For centuries, his people had taken a passive role, simply watching from afar. But perhaps it was time to do more. Perhaps it was time for humans to understand what it felt like to be powerless. He pressed his hand to the screen, and a silent signal pulsed through the air. Far below, Karen's car radio suddenly crackled with static. She frowned, tapping the screen. Ugh. Stupid thing. Then, her headlights flickered. The street ahead, once brightly lit, went completely dark. Karen's stomach twisted. She slowed the car, gripping the wheel tighter. What the hell? And then, without warning, everything around her went silent. The city disappeared. The road, the buildings, even the night sky. Gone. There was only darkness. And in that moment, for the first time in her life, Karen felt something she had never felt before. Fear. Karen's hands gripped the wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. What just happened? One moment, she had been driving through the city, her expensive car purring like a well-fed cat. The next, everything was gone. No headlights. No streetlights. No sound of traffic. No distant hum of life. Just darkness. A cold shiver crawled down her spine. She reached for her phone, but the screen was dead. The dashboard? Dead. The car? Completely silent. Her breath quickened. This isn't funny, she muttered, as if someone might be listening. What the hell is going on? Then, a voice. Soft. Calm. Familiar. You always wanted to be the one in control. Karen's chest tightened. She knew that voice. Her eyes darted to the rearview mirror, and there he was. The waiter. Sitting in her back seat, perfectly composed, hands folded in his lap. His uniform was gone. Instead, he wore something sleek, almost glowing, as if the very air around him shimmered. Karen's blood ran cold. What are you, how did you? I watched you tonight, he said, his voice steady. The way you treated people. The way you made them feel small. You've done this many times before, haven't you? Karen's pulse pounded in her ears. Listen, if this is some kind of prank, you're gonna regret it. I'll have you arrested. Do you know who I am? The waiter tilted his head slightly. Yes. I know exactly who you are. Karen tried to move, to yank open the door, to run, but she couldn't. Her body wouldn't respond. Her fingers stayed locked around the wheel, her legs frozen in place. She couldn't even turn her head fully to face him. She was trapped. Panic flooded her. What did you do to me? I haven't done anything, the waiter replied. This is your moment to listen. Karen's breathing turned shallow. Listen to what? The waiter leaned forward slightly. To what it feels like, he said softly. To have no power. The darkness around them shifted. Shapes flickered, blurry, like a reflection on rippling water. Then, suddenly, she wasn't in the car anymore. She was somewhere else entirely. And the nightmare was just beginning. Karen gasped. 1 second, she had been in her car, trapped, unable to move. Now, she was standing in an endless white room. No doors. No windows. No walls. Just an open, empty space stretching in all directions. Her breathing was sharp and fast. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. She turned, searching for an exit, but there was nothing. The only thing in the room was him. The waiter stood a few feet away, completely calm, watching her. Karen's voice wavered. Where am I? What did you do? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he raised his hand, and suddenly, the air around them shifted. The white room flickered, and transformed. Karen found herself in a small, dimly lit restaurant. But something was wrong. The colors were dull. The air felt heavy. She looked down at herself, and nearly screamed. Her expensive clothes were gone. Instead, she wore a faded, worn-down uniform. A cheap apron was tied around her waist. In her hands was a tray of drinks. Karen blinked, her mind struggling to process. What is this? The waiter, no, not a waiter anymore, something more, stood beside her. You like to look down on people, he said. Now, you'll see the world through their eyes. A bell rang. Table 4, get moving, a voice barked behind her. Karen spun around. A grumpy-looking man stood behind a counter, glaring at her. He looked past her, his expression cold. Lazy workers don't last here, he muttered. Karen's hands tightened around the tray. This was a joke, right? A dream? She turned back to the restaurant, her eyes scanning the tables. Then she saw something that made her stomach drop. At the nearest table sat herself. Karen. Her real self. Sitting with an arrogant smirk, tapping her perfectly manicured nails on the table, waiting impatiently. Her voice rang out, sharp and entitled. Hello? Service? Or do I have to remind you how to do your job? Karen froze. Her own voice sounded different. Crueler than she had ever realized. The other customers glanced at her, some whispering, others shaking their heads. But, just like before, no one spoke up. She turned to the waiter, her guide, her captor, whatever he was. No. No, this isn't real. It's as real as it needs to be, he said simply. Karen tried to throw the tray down, to storm away, to wake up. But she couldn't. Because this time, she was the one serving the table. Karen's breath came fast and shallow. This wasn't happening. This wasn't real. Yet, the weight of the tray in her hands, the sweat forming on her forehead, the impatient tapping of her own fingers on the table, it all felt too real. Her other self, the Karen she knew, sighed dramatically. I don't have all day, she snapped. Are you going to take my order or just stand there like an idiot? Karen flinched. She had heard those words before, but never from this side. Her hands trembled as she reached for a notepad in her apron pocket. What would you like to order? Her voice felt wrong, meek, small, unsure. Her other self sneered. Oh great, another one who can't even speak properly. Fantastic. A low murmur came from the nearby tables. People noticed what was happening, but just like before, no one did anything. Karen swallowed hard. She wanted to fight back. To yell at her other self, to say, do you even hear yourself? Do you know how horrible you sound? But she couldn't. Her legs felt like they were stuck to the floor, her voice unable to rise above a whisper. Her own voice, her real self, spoke again, this time looking at the napkin on the table. This is dirty. Karen blinked. What? I said this is dirty, her other self repeated, her voice cold and demanding. She picked up the napkin between two fingers like it was contaminated and threw it on the floor. Pick it up. Karen stared at the crumpled napkin on the ground. A slow, sinking feeling spread in her chest. Was this what they felt? The people she had insulted, humiliated, treated like they were beneath her? She wanted to refuse. She wanted to scream and oh. But before she could stop herself, her body moved on its own. She bent down, picked up the napkin, and placed it back on the table. And as she stood back up, her own voice cut through the air. No tip for you. Karen's stomach twisted. Her other self tossed a single coin onto the table. Not a 20. Not a 10. Not even $1. Just a single, cheap coin. And then, everything shifted again. The restaurant flickered, dissolving around her. The noise, the people, the smells, all gone. Once again, Karen stood in the empty white room. But this time, she wasn't alone. The waiter stood in front of her, his face unreadable. Karen looked down at her shaking hands, then up at him. Why are you doing this to me? His expression didn't change. Because it's the only way you'll understand. Karen clenched her fists, fighting the lump in her throat. Okay, she snapped. I get it. It was awful. I was awful. Can I go now? The waiter's eyes darkened. No. Karen's breath hitched. This was just the beginning, he said. And before she could react, the world shifted again. The world blurred around Karen, twisting and reforming. She stumbled forward, blinking rapidly. Where was she now? The air smelled different, stale, cold. The floor beneath her feet was rough, uneven. When she looked down, she wasn't wearing the restaurant uniform anymore. She was in ragged clothes. Torn, dirty. And she wasn't alone. She stood in the middle of a crowded city sidewalk, surrounded by people who didn't even look at her. She was invisible. Karen turned, confused, trying to grab someone's arm. Hey! Excuse me, where am I? A man in a suit walked right past her without even glancing in her direction. She tried again. Hello? Can someone tell me what's going on? Nothing. Then she heard laughter. Karen turned toward the noise and saw a group of well-dressed people standing outside a cafe. They were laughing at someone. Her stomach twisted as she looked toward the source of their amusement. A homeless woman sat on the ground nearby, a cardboard sign in her lap. Her hands were thin, her face tired. She looked defeated. And then Karen realized, it was her. She was the homeless woman. Karen's breath caught in her throat. No. No, this couldn't be real. One of the laughing people, a woman in expensive heels, scoffed and dropped a single coin onto the ground. Here, the woman said mockingly. Go buy yourself a life. The coin clinked against the pavement. Karen froze. She had said those words before. She had done this before. The people walked away, still laughing. No one helped. No one even looked at her. Her stomach rumbled. Her throat was dry. She suddenly realized she was starving. She bent down, picked up the coin with shaking fingers, and turned toward a nearby food stall. The vendor, a bored-looking man, barely glanced at her. Hey, Karen said, holding out the coin. Can I get something to eat? The vendor smirked. Not for that. Karen frowned. But I'm starving. He shrugged. Not my problem. She felt a wave of shame crash over her. How many times had she dismissed people like this? How many times had she been this man? Karen opened her mouth to beg, but before she could, the world shifted again. She gasped, suddenly standing in the white room again. Her knees buckled, and she fell to the floor, breathing hard. The waiter stood before her, watching silently. Karen lifted her head. Tears burned in her eyes. Please, no more. He tilted his head slightly. Are you beginning to understand? Karen swallowed hard. She did. For the first time in her life, she truly understood. But was it too late? Karen lay on the cold white floor, her chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. The images still burned in her mind, the humiliation, the hunger, the loneliness. She had never known what it was like to be ignored, to be powerless. Until now. Slowly, she pushed herself up on shaking arms. Her throat was dry, her voice barely above a whisper. I get it. The waiter stood in front of her, expression unreadable. Do you? Karen swallowed hard. Did she? She had always told herself that the world was fair. That people got what they deserved. That she was successful because she worked hard and others just didn't try. But now? She had felt the weight of judgment from people who didn't know her. She had begged for food and been turned away. She had been treated like she was nothing. She finally understood what it felt like to be on the other side. Tears burned in her eyes. I was wrong, she whispered. The waiter remained silent. Karen looked up at him, really looked at him. I was wrong about everything. The way I treated people, the way I acted like I was better than them. I see it now. For the first time, the waiter's expression softened. Karen let out a shaky breath. But what am I supposed to do? The waiter studied her, his gaze piercing. Then, he simply asked. What will you do with this knowledge? Karen's hands curled into fists. The answer came to her instantly. She would change. She had to. No, she wanted to. For the first time in her life, she wanted to do better. She lifted her chin, her voice stronger. I don't want to be that person anymore. The waiter nodded slightly. Then prove it. Karen barely had time to react before everything dissolved into light. She gasped, eyes flying open. She was back. Sitting in her car. The city was still alive around her, traffic moving, people walking. Her hands gripped the wheel, but they weren't frozen anymore. Her phone lit up. The radio played softly. It was as if nothing had happened. But Karen knew the truth. Something had happened. And she was not the same person who had entered this car. Karen sat in her car, staring at the city lights, her hands still gripping the steering wheel. Her heart pounded. Had it all been a dream? A hallucination? But deep down, she knew. It was real. The coldness of the sidewalk, the weight of the tray in her hands, the sting of being ignored and laughed at, it was all real. And now, she had a choice. For the first time in her life, she felt something she had never felt before, shame. Shame for the way she had treated others. Shame for how blind she had been. Shame for who she had become. Slowly, she reached into her purse and pulled out her wallet. Her fingers trembled as she took out a crisp $100 bill. She looked at the restaurant she had stormed out of earlier. Through the glass windows, she saw the waiter, him. He was still working, still moving with quiet grace, still treating everyone with patience and kindness. And now, she saw him differently. Karen took a deep breath. Then, she opened the car door and stepped out. The restaurant fell silent as Karen walked inside. The waiter looked up as she approached. His face remained calm, unreadable. Karen hesitated. Her throat felt tight. But this time, she wasn't here to demand anything. She took a deep breath and spoke, her voice softer than before. I'm sorry. The words felt strange, but right. A flicker of something passed through the waiter's eyes. He said nothing. Karen placed the $100 bill on the table. And, this is for you. The waiter glanced at the money but didn't move to take it. Karen swallowed hard. Not because I have to, she added quickly. Because I want to. For a long moment, the waiter simply studied her. Then, slowly, he gave a small nod. Karen exhaled, feeling a weight she didn't even realize she had been carrying lift from her shoulders. She turned and walked toward the door. But just as she reached it, she stopped. Outside, on the sidewalk, a homeless man sat in the cold. Karen hesitated for only a second before stepping toward him. Here, she said, kneeling beside him and offering her coat. The man's eyes widened in surprise. What's this for? Karen's lips trembled. How many times had she ignored people like him? How many times had she looked away? Because I was wrong, she whispered. And I want to do better. For the first time, she meant it. As she walked away, she felt lighter. In the restaurant, the waiter watched her go, a knowing expression on his face. Above the city, unseen by all, a silent craft hovered in the sky. A voice echoed softly in the air. Humanity still has hope.